That is a booking.
Graeme Souness names 6 players who were terrified of him, and at first, that sounds like the mark of a true football hard man. It sounds like a badge of honor, a tough Scot who never backed down, who never blinked, who made grown professionals feel small just by walking into a room. And in many ways, that is exactly what he was. Before Graeme Souness scared anyone, he was one of the finest footballers this country has ever produced. He could pass, he could tackle, he could read a match better than almost anyone on the pitch. Bob Paisley signed him for Liverpool in January 1978. Liverpool paid a record £350,000 for him, taking him from Middlesbrough. That fee alone showed how highly he was rated. Once he arrived at Anfield, Souness quickly became the heartbeat of the team. He controlled matches. He dictated the tempo. He was strong enough to win the ball back and clever enough to use it well the moment he had it. Liverpool won 5 league titles with him in the side. They won 3 European Cups with him driving the midfield. He was not just tough, he was brilliant. Teammates trusted him with the ball in the biggest matches of their careers. Opponents feared facing him, not because he shouted the loudest, but because he could hurt you with a pass just as easily as he could hurt you with a tackle. That combination is rare in football. Most hard men are remembered only for their toughness. Souness is remembered for his toughness and his talent together. And that is exactly why his story is so complicated. So, use the hype feature now and give this video some hype, because the story of Graeme Souness is one that football fans still argue about today. But here is where the story gets more complicated. Souness did not just believe in hard work and talent. He believed fear was part of leadership. He believed that if players were scared of him, they would try harder, focus more, and never take a night off. That idea worked in one era of football. It made him look like a warrior. But as the years went on, that same idea started to look like a serious flaw. The fear he created was never just a side effect of his brilliance. For Graeme Souness, fear was a tool. He used it as a player. He used it as a manager. He even used it later as a television pundit, judging modern players by the same harsh standard he judged himself. He wanted his teammates to be tough. He wanted total control in the dressing room. He wanted every single player around him to know exactly who was in charge. That desire for control was not always a bad thing on its own. Every successful football team needs some form of order and discipline to function properly. The problem was never that Souness wanted standards. The problem was the method he kept choosing to enforce them. Football has always respected strong leaders. But there's a difference between leading with authority and leading through fear. Too often, Graeme Souness chose the second option, and it eventually cost him. Think about it like this. A manager can build a strong dressing room in 2 very different ways. He can build it through trust, clear communication, and setting an example that players want to follow. Or he can build it through fear, where players do what they are told simply because they are afraid of what happens if they do not. Both methods can produce results in the short term, but only one of them tends to last. Souness had the footballing intelligence to lead the first way. He understood the game as well as almost anyone of his generation. Yet again and again, when pressure built up around him, he reached for the second method instead. Souness was strong enough to lead through skill and respect alone. Instead, far too often, he chose to scare people into line, and that decision would follow him through the rest of his career. To understand why Souness turned to fear so quickly, you have to go back to where he learned it. Long before Souness frightened anyone else, he was the one who felt afraid. At Liverpool, there was one coach who terrified even him. His name was Ronnie Moran, and he was known around the club as the boot room sergeant major. Moran was not the manager. He did not get his photo in the papers. But inside Melwood, he ran the place with total authority. Moran never let players get comfortable. Even after winning a league title, he would tear into the squad if training standards dropped for even one day. Souness openly admitted that Ronnie Moran was the person who frightened him the most in his entire career. That single fact tells you everything about the world that shaped him. Moran did not need a loud voice from the touchline or a famous name in the papers. He earned his authority every single day. On the training pitch, checking that standards never dropped. Even players who had just won a European Cup were not safe from his sharp tongue if their effort slipped for even one session. That environment produced some of the greatest players English football has ever seen. It also produced a young Graeme Souness, who learned very early on that fear could be a powerful tool inside a winning dressing room. There is one story that explains this better than any other. In 1984, Liverpool played Dinamo Bucharest in the semi-final of the European Cup. During the first leg at Anfield, Souness threw a hidden punch that broke the jaw of Romanian midfielder Leka Movila. Nobody saw it happen at the time. Movila ended up with ice packed inside a towel wrapped around his head. After the match, Souness was walking up the stairs at Anfield, laughing to himself about what he had done. Suddenly, two large Romanian security men stepped out of the shadows. They were furious and they were coming for him. Before anything could happen, Ronnie Moran appeared from nowhere. He puffed out his chest and unleashed a wall of fierce, angry language at the two men. They backed away completely. Souness later said he was forever grateful that Ronnie Moran stopped him from being hurt that night. He admitted that the Liverpool players were frightened of Moran, but he was clear that Moran was not a bully. Moran simply knew how to be ferocious when the moment demanded it. That night taught Souness something he never forgot. In his mind, fear and loyalty were tied together. If someone scared you, but also protected you, that fear became part of trust. Souness carried that lesson into his own management career. He believed that if he could recreate Ronnie Moran's kind of fear, he could build the same kind of loyalty. But football was changing fast, and what worked in the boot room at Melwood would not always work in a modern dressing room filled with millionaires who had agents' media platforms, and far more power than players had ever had before. Ronnie Moran never needed to grab a player by the throat or challenge anyone to a fight. His fear came from consistency and standards, built up over years inside one club. Souness would later try to shortcut that process, using sudden bursts of aggression instead of years of quiet authority. That shortcut rarely worked as well as he hoped it would. Moran built his authority slowly over decades of consistent behavior that players could always predict and understand. Souness, by contrast, often relied on sudden explosions of anger that appeared without warning, and that difference mattered far more than he ever seemed to realize. Before we look at the 6 people who felt this fear most directly, it helps to see how far Souness was willing to go even on the pitch itself. In 1988, Souness was player-manager of Rangers. His side faced Steaua Bucharest in a European tie, and it was here that Souness produced one of the most brutal moments British football has ever seen. He targeted Romanian midfielder Iosif Rotariu with a knee-height challenge, studs up, aimed directly at his thigh. It was not a football tackle. It ignored the ball completely. It was built purely to hurt. Rotariu later said that the challenge could have ended his career. He even said his life could have been in danger, given exactly where the studs landed, close enough to a major artery that a slightly different angle could have caused catastrophic injury. Souness showed no guilt in the moment. There was no punishment on the pitch and no real consequence afterwards. That tackle helped build his reputation across Europe as a fearsome, uncontrollable force. But that is exactly the problem. This was not bravery. This was not strength used the right way. This was power with no control attached to it. And it is one of the darkest examples of how far Souness let his belief in fear actually go. Football has always had physical challenges. Strong tackles are part of the game and always have been. But there is a clear line between a strong tackle and a tackle designed purely to injure another human being. What Souness did to Rotariu sat firmly on the wrong side of that line, and no amount of winning mentality can fully explain it away. That single moment in Bucharest tells you something important. The same intensity that made Souness a great footballer could also turn into something frightening and dangerous when there was nobody there to stop him. Years later, when Souness became a manager full-time, this same instinct followed him into the dressing room. Nowhere was that clearer than at Newcastle United in 2004, in his dealings with a talented but difficult forward named Craig Bellamy. Bellamy had spent his previous years under Sir Bobby Robson, a manager who protected him and gave him room to express himself. When Souness arrived at Newcastle in October 2004, he wanted something completely different. He wanted total control, and he made it clear that things would be done his way or not at all. Souness and his staff had doubts about Bellamy from early on. Bellamy had pulled out of a match at Anfield, saying he had a back injury. The very next day, he trained without any problem at all. That single moment planted deep suspicion in Souness's mind. In his eyes, this was exactly the kind of soft, protected culture he wanted to remove from the club. He believed players needed to prove their commitment every single day, not just when it suited them. Souness had built his own career on that principle, showing up ready to compete no matter how he felt physically. and he expected the same standard from every player under his charge, regardless of their reputation or their wage packet. Tension grew quickly after that. Bellamy reportedly called Newcastle a rubbish club with a rubbish manager, saying it in front of two new signings who had just arrived at the club. For Souness, that kind of comment could not go unanswered. The disagreement turned physical on the training ground. Souness grabbed Bellamy by the neck during a heated row between the two men. Bellamy did not back down. He told Souness that he was the best player at the club. That kind of comment, said in anger and in front of teammates, was never going to calm Souness down. If anything, it pushed him further. Instead of calming the situation, Souness raised the stakes even further. He looked at Bellamy and said, "You and me, in the gym, now." It was not a joke, it was a direct challenge to fight. Bellamy later said in his own book that Souness's tough act did not actually scare him personally, but whether Bellamy felt fear or not almost did not matter, because Souness still won the argument that counted. Bellamy was fined 2 weeks' wages. Newcastle chairman Freddie Shepherd backed Souness completely, accusing Bellamy of cheating the club. Not long after, Bellamy was sent out on loan to Celtic, effectively removed from the club he had joined with genuine ambition. What had started as a football disagreement about effort and attitude had turned into a full power struggle, and Souness made absolutely sure that everyone at the club knew exactly who had won it. Souness may have looked strong throughout that entire situation, but grabbing a player by the neck and challenging him to a fight in the gym is not clever man management. It is a manager turning a football disagreement into a physical threat, and that is a serious problem no matter how many trophies a manager has won in the past. Bellamy went on to have a long and successful career after leaving Newcastle, playing for several major clubs across Europe. But the way his time under Souness ended remains one of the clearest examples of how quickly Souness would turn to physical intimidation the moment he felt his authority was being tested. If the Bellamy situation showed Souness's aggressive side, what happened at Blackburn Rovers in March 2004 showed something even more troubling. This time, Souness did not just threaten the player, he physically injured one of his own men on the training pitch. Souness wanted to build the same intense competitive culture at Blackburn that he remembered from his own playing days at Liverpool. He had brought together two experienced strikers, Andy Cole and Dwight Yorke, hoping they could recreate the kind of success they once had together at Manchester United, where the pair had formed one of the most feared striker partnerships English football had seen in years. But results were not coming, and Souness grew increasingly frustrated with the squad around them. He felt the players lacked the same hunger and toughness he remembered from his own playing days. And that frustration slowly built up session after session, week after week, until it eventually spilled over into something far more serious than a simple training ground disagreement. During a six-a-side training match, Dwight Yorke tried to tackle his own manager as part of normal play. Souness, over 50 years old at the time, responded in a shocking way. He came in with a two-footed studs-up tackle aimed straight at knee height into Yorke's shin. Andy Cole, who watched the whole thing happen, later said the cut was so deep that you could actually see the white of Yorke's bone through the wound. It was the kind of injury normally caused by a serious match tackle, not a routine training session between a manager and his own player. The rest of the squad watched in shock, unsure how to react to what they had just witnessed on their own training pitch. Some players later said they had never seen anything like it before, a manager old enough to be the father of most of his squad, deliberately injuring one of his own senior professionals in what was supposed to be a routine session. Souness did not apologize. He did not even stop the session. He simply told the rest of the players to carry on. Yorke was left in serious pain and clearly angry about what had just happened. Later, he confronted Souness directly in the staff canteen, with the club's chief executive standing nearby. Souness's response was to call Yorke a playboy and to insist that players and managers kicking lumps out of each other was completely normal in football. For many people watching from outside the club, that explanation did not sit right at all. A training ground injury caused by a manager is very different from an accidental clash between two competing players, and treating the two as the same thing only made the situation feel even worse. A manager is supposed to protect his players, guide them, and get the very best out of them. Injuring one of your own senior professionals to prove a point about toughness is not strong leadership. It is the clearest example of Souness's old-school method going far beyond what football should ever allow, and it left a lasting mark on how people viewed him as a manager. Years later, this story is still one of the first things people mention when they talk about Souness's time in football management, and it is easy to understand why. By April 2005, Souness had built a reputation at Newcastle as a manager who ruled through fear. That reputation was tested again during one of the most dramatic moments English football has ever produced inside a single dressing room. Newcastle were losing 3-0 at home to Aston Villa. The match was already falling apart. Stephen Taylor had been sent off earlier for handball, leaving Newcastle down to 10 men. Then, in front of around 50,000 supporters, two Newcastle teammates, Lee Bowyer and Kieran Dyer, started fighting each other on the pitch. It happened because Bowyer felt Dyer was refusing to pass him the ball. Punches were thrown in full view of the crowd. Live on TV, in one of the most embarrassing scenes English football has ever produced. Cameras caught the whole thing. Pundits in the studio watched in disbelief as two teammates traded punches with the match still technically going on around them. It was the kind of moment that would define a club's reputation for years afterwards. Newcastle supporters in the stadium that day could hardly believe what they were watching. Two players who were supposed to be on the same side were trading blows while their own team was already losing heavily to their opponents. When the match ended, both players walked down the tunnel toward the dressing room. Waiting for them was Graeme Souness, and he was furious. Souness did not simply shout at them or promise to find them. He offered them both something far more direct. He told them, "If you want to fight, I'll beat both of you." Bowyer had one of the toughest reputations in English football at the time. He was not a player who backed down easily from anyone. Yet in that moment, even Bowyer was visibly affected by Souness's presence. Teammates in the room later described the silence that followed, a silence that said more about Souness's authority than any amount of shouting ever could. Bowyer went on to receive a 7-match ban from the Football Association. He was also fined 6 weeks' wages, thought to be around £200,000. Souness later told the media that Bowyer's actions were indefensible and few people disagreed with him. The whole country had already seen the fight unfold live, so there was little room left for Bowyer to argue his case in public. There is no question that Newcastle needed order restored after that day. A manager has every right to be angry when two of his own players embarrass the club on live television. But even here, in a moment where Souness genuinely had the right to be furious, the tool he reached for first was still the threat of physical violence. Even when he was right to be angry, the method never really changed. It shows just how deeply fear was built into the way Souness operated. It was not just a reaction he used in the worst moments of his career. It was his default setting, the first response that came to him whenever discipline needed restoring quickly. Years afterwards, Bowyer himself admitted a strange kind of respect for how Souness handled that day, saying it was one of the few things that could have stopped his own temper in the heat of the moment. Even the players who feared him most often looked back with a grudging kind of admiration, which says a great deal about how powerful that presence really was. Kieran Dyer's side of that same story shows just how deep the fear went that day. While Bowyer faced Souness's fury directly, Dyer experienced something slightly different, but just as intense. As the fight was breaking up, Dyer was being physically held back by Newcastle's own club masseurs in the tunnel. He was angry, adrenaline still running high from the brawl. His mind still replaying the moment Bowyer had lashed out at him in front of the entire stadium. Then Souness walked into the dressing room, and according to those present, the entire mood in the room shifted instantly. The chaos and shouting turned into something closer to silence and dread. Players who had just been screaming at each other in the tunnel suddenly said nothing at all. Nobody wanted to draw Souness's attention toward themselves in that moment. Souness told the squad that he was going to go outside and review the video footage of the incident with journalists watching alongside him. He gave Dyer a direct warning. If he saw what he thought he had seen on that footage, he would fight both players himself. For Dyer, that warning changed everything in an instant. His anger from the fight quickly turned into fear and shame. He was no longer thinking about Bowyer. He was thinking about what Souness might do, and about how badly he had let down his manager and his club in front of the entire country. That kind of pressure does not disappear quickly. It stays with a player long after the dressing room empties and the cameras stop rolling. When Souness eventually returned, he decided that Dyer had mainly been on the receiving end of the fight rather than the one who started it. That judgment offered Dyer some small relief, but it did nothing to erase what he had already felt standing in that silent room. Dyer avoided the harshest of Souness's anger that day, but he still served a 3-match suspension after Newcastle's appeal to reduce it failed. What this moment shows is that Souness did not simply punish players when they crossed the line. He made the entire dressing room feel like a courtroom, and inside that courtroom he was judge, jury, and executioner all at once. For a player like Dyer, that kind of pressure left a mark that stayed with him long after the punishment itself had ended. For a young player already dealing with the shame of fighting a teammate on live television, that kind of dressing room experience only made a difficult day feel even heavier. Souness's belief and fear did not disappear when his time as a manager ended. It followed him straight into the television studio, where he became one of the most outspoken pundits in British football. Nowhere is that more obvious than in his repeated criticism of Liverpool forward Mohamed Salah. Speaking on a podcast, Souness called Salah the most selfish player he had ever witnessed, a comment that quickly spread across football media and sparked heated debate among supporters and pundits alike. It was a strong statement about one of the most successful forwards Liverpool has ever had, a player who has scored goals at a rate few in the club's history can match. Souness went further, arguing that Salah did not enjoy the physical side of football. He pointed to a specific match at Old Trafford, where Manchester United defender Lisandro Martinez hit Salah with a heavy tackle early in the game. According to Souness, Salah spent the rest of that match looking over his shoulder, worried about where Martinez was on the pitch. Souness argued that when things get physically difficult and an opponent puts real pressure on him, Salah simply disappears from the game because he avoids contact and never wants to get hurt. It is a harsh judgment to make about a player whose main strengths have always been his pace, his finishing, and his ability to find space rather than win physical battles in midfield. This is one of the clearest examples of how Souness still sees football through the lens of pain and fear, even decades after his own playing career ended. For Souness, a player's courage is often measured by how much physical punishment he is willing to absorb. That is not necessarily a fair way to judge every kind of footballer, especially a forward whose greatest weapons are pace, movement, and precision rather than physical confrontation. None of this is really about proving whether Salah is right or wrong to avoid unnecessary physical contact. It says just as much about Souness himself. He still measures football through an old lens built on pain, danger, and intimidation. The same lens that shaped his own playing career decades earlier. Football has changed a great deal since Souness played. Referees protect attacking players far more than they used to. Sports science has taught clubs that avoiding unnecessary contact often keeps a player fit and available for far longer. Whether that lens is fair to modern footballers is a question that says more about Souness's era than it does about the players he criticizes today. Fear was not only something Souness used against opponents or against players he later managed. It also shaped the way he treated his closest teammates during his own playing days at Liverpool, including men who would go on to become legends of the game in their own right. Souness and Kenny Dalglish held some of the highest standards ever seen inside an English dressing room. Between them, they were relentless, and they were not afraid to use sharp humor to keep their teammates fully focused. One player who often felt that pressure was defender Alan Hansen, a man widely respected as one of the finest defenders of his generation, admired for his calmness and his reading of the game. Dalglish once told a story about a match against Manchester United at Old Trafford, where United's high defensive line allowed Hansen to break clean through on goal. According to Dalglish, the moment Hansen realized it was just him against the goalkeeper, he became visibly terrified. Instead of calmly finishing the chance, Hansen panicked and passed the ball across. And by Dalglish's own admission, it was not even a particularly good pass. It became one of those stories that teammates repeated for years afterwards, told with a laugh, but never quite forgotten. This story might sound lighthearted compared to some of the other examples in this video, and in many ways it is, but it still reveals something important about the world Souness came from, even inside one of the greatest teams English football has ever produced. Fear was still part of daily life. It could be funny when told years later as a story between old friends, but it also shows just how demanding, and at times unforgiving, that Liverpool dressing room really was. The point here is not that Alan Hansen lacked courage. Nobody who watched his career would ever suggest that. The real point is that Souness grew up inside a footballing culture where even the very best players in the country could still be mocked without mercy for a single moment of hesitation. That culture shaped how Souness would go on to treat almost everyone around him for the rest of his career. If even Alan Hansen was not safe from harsh judgment inside that dressing room, it becomes much easier to understand why Souness later expected the same toughness from every single player he managed. The reach of Souness's fearsome reputation eventually spread far beyond football entirely, into a completely different world of professional sport. That fact alone shows just how powerful his image had become over the years. Drew McIntyre is one of the biggest stars in WWE. a company built entirely around presenting larger-than-life, intimidating characters to millions of fans. McIntyre stands 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighs well over 250 pounds. Throughout his career, he has shared a locker room with some of the most physically dominant athletes on the planet. Yet during an interview, McIntyre openly admitted that the one person he was truly scared of growing up was Graeme Souness. McIntyre explained that he grew up in Scotland during the years when Souness was in charge at Rangers, a period defined by intense aggression both on the pitch and on the touchline. Souness's name was known well beyond football supporters during those years. Even people who barely followed the sport knew his reputation as a fierce, uncompromising figure. For a professional wrestler who has built an entire career around looking fearsome to millions of people, admitting fear of anyone is unusual. The fact that he chose Souness says everything about how deep that reputation ran, even outside the world of football itself. This moment is powerful proof of just how far Souness's legend traveled. But it is also worth remembering something important. When fear becomes the main thing people remember about a person, it can quietly hide the real damage that fear may have caused along the way. It becomes part of the myth, repeated as entertainment, while the players who actually lived through it are often forgotten. A wrestler admitting fear on a podcast is entertaining. A player like Dwight York needing treatment for a training ground injury is not entertainment at all. Both stories involve the same man, but only one of them should really be treated as a laugh. For years, that fearsome reputation seemed unstoppable. But eventually, Souness discovered that even his aura had limits, and the moment that proved it had nothing to do with football tactics or physical confrontation at all. In 1991, while managing Rangers, Souness became involved in an incident that would later come to symbolize the end of his old style of leadership completely. At the club's training ground, McDiarmid Park, home of St. Johnstone, Souness grew angry after finding a broken kettle and a messy dressing room. Rather than staying silent, the club's tea lady, a woman named Aggie Moffat, confronted him directly about the mess. She was not intimidated by his reputation, his suits, or his status as one of the most feared men in Scottish football. To her, he was simply a man who had made a mess in her dressing room, and she was going to say so regardless of who he was. Souness later admitted, in his own words, that this lady was not scared of him, and that this single moment helped push him over the edge during his time in Scotland. It sparked a wider disagreement at the club, one serious enough that the chairman himself had to step in and calm things down between everyone involved. That story might sound small compared to everything else in this video, but it carries real weight. It arrived at the same time football itself was beginning to change. TV money was growing rapidly, player power was increasing. Players' unions were becoming more willing to challenge managers publicly. The old world, where a manager's fear alone could control everyone around him, was slowly disappearing. Souness could still frighten certain players well into the future, but he could no longer frighten the entire sport into staying exactly the way it had always been. The game itself was moving on, whether Souness was ready for that change or not. It is a strange thought, but true all the same. The manager who once broke a jaw with a hidden punch, who tackled an opponent studs up in a European tie, and who grabbed his own players by the neck, was finally beaten not by another hard man, but by a tea lady who simply refused to be frightened. So where does all of this leave Graeme Souness? There is no doubt that he was a phenomenal footballer. He was a natural winner and one of the toughest, most complete midfielders that British football has ever produced. His medals speak for themselves: 5 league titles, 3 European Cups. A player who could dominate the biggest matches in Europe through sheer skill and willpower combined. Younger players today still study clips of his passing range and his positional sense, trying to understand how one man controlled so many important matches for so many years. Nobody who understands football history could ever take that away from him. Even his harshest critics rarely question his ability on the pitch. That part of his legacy is completely secure, and it should remain that way. Talent and toughness are only part of his story. Time and time again, when Souness faced a difficult moment, whether with Bellamy, with York, with Bowyer, with Dyer, or even just talking about Salah on TV decades later, his instinct was almost always the same. He reached for fear first. Sometimes that fear kept people in line. Sometimes, as with Dwight York, it left a grown professional with a serious injury. Sometimes, as with Aggie Moffat, it simply failed to work at all. Across every era of his career, whether he was a player, a manager, or a pundit sitting behind a desk, the same instinct kept returning. again and again, no matter how much football itself had changed around him. That consistency is almost remarkable in its own way. Very few figures in football history have carried the exact same approach across 3 completely different roles, spanning nearly 5 decades of the sport. But consistency alone does not make an approach the right one. And by the end of his career, even Souness himself seemed to sense that the game had grown past his old methods. Graeme Souness deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest footballers this country has ever produced. His talent was real. His medals are real. Nobody should ever take that away from him. But the fear he built his reputation on should not be remembered as pure greatness either. In the end, Graeme Souness was not just feared because he was strong. He was feared because he genuinely believed that fear worked on the pitch, in the dressing room, and even years later from behind a TV desk. And the moment that belief finally started to crack against a tea lady who simply refused to be scared of him was the clearest sign of all that football, and the world around it had already moved on without him.